Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Empower Sounds podcast. My name is Mahika, and today we're going to talk about living alone and embracing solitude and all the things that I learned whilst living by myself abroad in this past year. Now, I think this was one of the most transformational things that I have done and that has happened to me in the past many, many years. And I think I got a lot out of this experience that I really am excited to share because I think there's so many lessons that you can learn from doing something like living alone, but you don't necessarily have to live alone to be able to learn these things. And so I wanted to share it with you. So a little bit of context. I lived in Madrid the past year. So fun. I had the best time ever. But I didn't know anyone who lived in Madrid that I was super, super close with. And the university that I was studying at was really far away. So I decided to get an apartment in the city and I lived alone. And that was kind of scary to think about because it was in a country where I wasn't completely fluent in the language. And if you want to know more about how I got fluent in Spanish, go check out those episodes because I did like a two-part series on that and it talks more about that whole journey. But when I was moving to Spain, I wasn't super comfortable. Like, I loved the language, but I wasn't the best with more technical things to do with landlords and contracts and all that stuff. So I was Google translating the whole contract and trying to figure out how to say all the different parts of the house. And luckily, it all worked out fine. And I got this amazing apartment I'm really grateful for. But it was scary. It was really scary. And I remember moving last August and going to this apartment, not really knowing a single person in the city and arriving. And I went with my dad and we unpacked all my stuff. And I remember the first day I had alone, and I realized that I hadn't spent much time alone before that point. I had always lived with people. I went from living with my family to living in a university dorm to living with other people and friends. And there was no moments that I had stayed completely alone. I hadn't traveled alone at that point. I hadn't, apart from maybe just like being alone in between activities or at the end of the day or doing things, I had never intentionally spent time alone. And that was kind of scary because when you're not used to your own company, it brings up some very interesting things. First of all, you realize that you're so used to being constantly stimulated by people, by conversation, by activities, by whatever else is happening. And kind of removing that is so interesting because you start to realize, what do I actually think when I have a moment alone and there is no one that I can chat to? And one of the biggest things that I learned was learning to self-process emotions, experiences, all these things. Because obviously moving to a country by yourself, not knowing anyone, being quite new at the language was scary, right? And I met a lot of cool people and I had a lot of really interesting experiences. But those first few days, I was like, oh my God, this is so crazy. And normally I would go and tell my roommates about that, or I'd go tell my friends about that, or I'd go tell my family about that. But there was no one around me immediately. And yeah, I could text people and stuff, but sometimes it doesn't work out logistically and all those kind of things. And you just want to have like a quick chat. And so what I started to learn how to do was to have those kind of conversations with myself. And yeah, okay, I'm gonna sound like this crazy woman who's saying like, oh yeah, I talk to myself. But the reality is we do talk to ourselves, all of us. Like we have an inner monologue, a subconscious dialogue. And so sometimes just making the space to voice that. And so now I'm like a really big advocate of this doesn't have to be all the time, but sometimes when something happens or when you feel something, it's okay to self-process and kind of go through those emotions alone first and then take it to other people to share. Because, yeah, sharing your emotions and experiences with your friends, your family, your community is so important. But learning to self-process is like, it's game changing. And I found it really scary at the start because, again, I was exposed to all of these new experiences and lessons all of a sudden, and I didn't know what to do with all that information. And so what I started to do was to record myself like speaking into my voice notes as if I was just having a conversation with someone, a roommate, a member of my family, a friend, whatever. And it was so interesting because I started talking through everything and then giving myself the pep talk that I needed. And that self-validation, self-trust was the most empowering thing ever because when you learn to self-regulate, to self-validate, and to build trust with yourself, is so cool. And also, one thing I love about the voice notes is I listen back to them now sometimes, and it's crazy to see like the stages of growth that you go through and all these different things that you think. And it's so fun as well to see like what was I getting so anxious about at that time? Because it doesn't matter in the future. And you learn to regulate. And then the more you do it, the easier it becomes. Also, one thing about living alone that's super interesting is coping mechanisms. Because I think community and friendship and surrounding yourself with people is a massive coping mechanism, right? Like when you're not feeling good, when you're feeling anxious, when you're feeling stressed, what do? You go and hang out with your people most of the time, right? And so learning how to process emotions and you realize like when I'm sad, when I'm angry, when I'm tired, how do I behave? And that is really enlightening, I guess. Um, and it can be kind of scary, but it also gives you like again an opportunity to change that and if you're not happy with it and work on your coping mechanisms so that they work for you, right? And having kind of almost a little menu of, okay, I had a bad day, I feel this, and this emotion. I know these are the strategies that I can do to feel better. That's that's something that's really handy and that's something that's really helped me like moving back again to London, to a super busy and overwhelming city, like knowing that I have these things in place as my good coping mechanisms that don't make me feel bad down the line. Like in the past, I guess it would be going out a lot and all those things, but now I try to do things that are more internal. Something creative. I love something creative. Speaking about creativity, another thing that's so interesting about living by yourself is you learn to really create your own space and create your way of doing things. And that's so fun. It can be, again, really scary because usually you just kind of inherit the system from your family of how things go. And yeah, okay, you probably decorate your room and the spaces, but moving to a new place and living alone is like having a blank canvas. And you really get to decide what's your way of doing things. And one of the biggest lessons I learned is like, with that freedom comes a lot of responsibility because if you don't make some sort of plan to take care of yourself and your space, you're going to get overwhelmed. And so I started doing like cleaning schedule and self-care schedule. And again, it sounds kind of, I don't know, I guess neurotic is the word, to plan all of these things. You could just do it like intuitively, I guess. But I found having a structure put in place was so useful. And also you realize that like again, you inherit a lot of these structures from your family and like how things were done when you were growing up. And then again, you know, uni residence, it's so different. And with friends, it can be different. So it's actually so liberating as well because you get to see like what things did I like from these previous ways of doing things and which things am I willing to change? And do I want to change? And you get to trial and error different systems that work for you. And that's really fun. And also learning to take pride in your space as well. Like when it's your home, like you feel so good about like taking care of it and you realize that you take care of things that you care about. And so I think living alone and learning to take care of my space really helped me kind of learn to take care of myself, which sounds a bit weird, but every time I was cleaning my apartment, instead of being like, oh, this is a chore, I hate this, which to be honest, okay, that would happen sometimes. But sometimes when I'd be cleaning my place, I'd be thinking like, I'm so lucky to have the space to myself and I love it. And I feel even though I'm cleaning and like cleaning is not the most fun, like mopping or vacuuming is not the most thrilling activity in the world. I just feel so lucky that I get to clean the space and I get to take care of it. And you realize that like it's fun to take care of things that you care about. And so with that idea, it makes sense, right? That it should be fun to take care of yourself. And so living alone actually made me feel way more confident about taking care of myself and making sure that I treated myself with respect and treated my space with respect as well. And that links to boundaries. So I think when you live alone, especially when you live alone as a woman, sometimes you have to consider safety and like who you let into your home. And obviously, I was way, way, way more reserved again because I moved to a city. I didn't know that many people, and also, again, safety is a big thing, right? Before, I used to be the kind of person that was very like door open. Anyone can come into my space. Like at uni, my door was always open. There was always people in my room, which was so fun. I loved it, and it was really fun. But I learned again, there's a balance to be striked because when people enter your space, like they enter your world, and it's something that's really personal and private. And so like learning to be more discerning about who you let into your life and into your space was also really game changing for me. You have to be careful not to take it too far the other way and isolate yourself. It's nice to have people, and one of my favorite things was hosting and having people over. And all my friends would come over to the place and we'd have dinner together, and it was so cute. But again, with that freedom comes the responsibility of making sure that people in your life and in your space respect you. And again, this house, this apartment, made me realize that I need to do the same with my life. Like, forget my space, forget my apartment. I need to be more mindful of who I let into my day-to-day space. And that sounds mean, right? And I spent so many years of my life trying to avoid being a mean person because I really didn't want that image. But then you learn that being discerning doesn't make you mean. And sometimes when you are just too open, you put yourself in situations that aren't the most positive. And that's okay. That's a learning experience. And it's a good thing to be open. Like, I'm not saying don't be open to meeting new people and being welcoming and letting people into your life and letting people into your space. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, do I want to invite this person into my home? And do I want to invite this person into my life, and into my space? And I've been doing this thing recently, which is an energy audit where every week or every time I'm on a train, I like to do like a plus column, a minus column, and a neutral column. And I write down that week, like all the things, the habits, the encounters, the interactions that gave me joy, that gave me lots of energy, things that made me feel anxious, that kind of took away my energy and made me feel really bad afterwards, and the things that were neutral. And seeing that and seeing if things were coming up again and again was really interesting because it allowed me to spend more time on things that gave me joy and people that made me feel good and didn't make me feel anxious about myself, which is why I feel like living alone in that time was probably this era of my life where I was the most secure I've ever been because everyone in my life made me feel safe and supported, and that was so beautiful. And I like to think that I tried to do the same for them. And it made me realize that we're all deserving of that, right? And when you do that, you create your space and you create your life in such an abundant way that it's worth like protecting your peace a little bit. And again, I want to caveat all of these things by saying that you should never be closed off. And another thing that I learned from this experience of living alone was sometimes when you don't feel good, it's so much easier to isolate yourself because that's just the default, right? Like you're by yourself. And so when you don't feel good, actually making an effort to let people into your space, your life, your mindset, and also like trying to leave that and making sure that you leave the house. That was a big thing, especially I lived in Spain and so winter wasn't that bad, but when it got like darker and colder or when I was overwhelmed, like sometimes I would just stay at home and I had to really remind myself, like, come on, like leave the house, even if it's for a little bit. And I think when you have a group of people with you, it's so much easier to like have that because if you have activities that someone else is doing that you can tag along to, it makes it so much easier. You have like someone to check in on you. And it's so important that you check in on yourself in the same way and actually like makes time to leave that space as well and not get too isolated in your bubble. Speaking of that, though, on the other hand, I do also think that it's so nice because you start to know when to say no to things. So I think in the past, I would find it really hard to say no to plans because everything just seemed fun. I love fun. I always wanted to say yes to everything. And I didn't realize that I get really, I'm sensitive and I get tired. And if I'm sensitive or I'm feeling tired or I'm feeling anxious, leaving the house and going out or going and doing this really big social plan is something that's going to make me feel worse. And I just need some time to relax, physically, mentally, whatever. And living alone made it so much easier to say no and just to sometimes take time alone and sit and do something creative or take rest or even just like watch some Netflix. And again, I'm not saying like there's something noble about sitting at home and isolating yourself and not going and doing things. You learn to listen to yourself and realize like, oh, I'm not feeling it today, but next time. Or when you're out, because you know that like you only have to go home to you, you just leave when you're tired. And that was so interesting because I think for the longest time I was so used to what everyone else wanted. And I think everyone around me was the same as well. Like we always wanted to make sure that everyone was okay and having the best time. So I kind of didn't know how to listen to myself and what I wanted and when I was tired. And taking that time to build that trust again was so cool. And that's what I'd say is like the biggest takeaway from living alone. You build so much trust with yourself because honestly, you have no other choice. You get a lot of freedom and you have to learn to use that responsibly and make a structure for yourself, like I said. Learn to self-process and create a balance of like doing things for yourself and doing things outside and who you let into your space and your home and all those things. But also, you have to, I think, I mean, you don't have to, but it makes life a lot easier when you learn to become a version of yourself that you like. Because when you're living alone, you are most likely to spend the most amount of time by yourself. It's not always the case because you can always be out and about and doing things. And also, if you live with other people, you can also be spending a lot of time alone. But I think this past year was the year that I spent the most time alone. And I really invested in becoming a version of myself that I actually enjoyed spending time with. So it wasn't just like a default of, oh, okay, we're home now, we're alone now. And that took time, like you have to learn to become a version of yourself that you'd actually be friends with. And that sounds cheesy and it sounds a bit cringe, but it's so important because it means that you start feeling a lot less lonely. Now, one thing I found really interesting about loneliness is there were many times when I was living alone that I was in my house and I was like cooking or I was watching a show or I was doing something. And I would think, I'm so happy. I'm so happy to be here. And I'm so grateful that I'm in this space, but I feel really lonely. And that was so weird. I didn't realize that you could feel happy and lonely at the same time. And that was like a really weird emotional space to navigate of realizing that you can be so content with where you are and still want to surround yourself with people. And I think that really gave me so much appreciation for the people in my life because it made me realize that, wow, like I really care about my friends, my family, my community. And at the same time, it was so empowering to know that I can still feel lonely and happy. That means that I never have to be scared about being lonely because it's not scary. Like, okay, yeah, I take that back. It can be scary. And it's not always the nicest feeling in the world. But when you learn to like sit in that feeling and living alone gives you an opportunity where you don't really have a choice but to sit in that feeling, you learn that loneliness is not that bad and it makes you realize like who and what you actually care about and what you value and who you want to spend time with and what you enjoy spending your time doing. I think like sometimes FOMO and jealousy get a bad rep, and don't get me wrong, like with good reason, but at the same time, sometimes when you have the sense of like, oh, I wish I was in this place, you realize that's actually where you want to go. And sometimes like in the past, I think, like I said, when I was a bit younger, I would just constantly be surrounded with people and be doing activities. So I never had the opportunity to miss anyone or miss doing anything because I just never wanted to miss out on anything. And I was just constantly stimulated or going out or doing something. And that was a really hard mindset to get out of because I felt this need to constantly maximizing my time and doing the most productive things, whether that's socially or in terms of work or in terms of, I don't know, the gym and all these things. And so living alone gave me a lot more buffer time and a lot more space to just exist. And I found that really difficult. Existing was kind of hard, because I didn't know how to just sit there and process like my emotions and my thoughts and whatever without having something to do or someone to talk to or some activity to like be engaged with. And so that is the biggest takeaway, I think, of learning to build trust with yourself and knowing that you can feel lonely and happy at the same time. And there is nothing bad about loneliness inherently. Yeah, it can suck, but at the same time, like it shows you what you really care about and also like learning to bring joy into that feeling as well and learning to give yourself company and be your best friend is so key. Another thing I want to quickly talk about is landlords and landlord drama because I'm talking about trust, but self-trust is built when you have the opportunity, not one, to just take care of yourself, but two, to do hard things. So me and my landlord, we had a very interesting relationship in that I would bring problems to him with the flat and he would just ignore me. Uh, and I had issues with my floor, with my pipes, and like having not having running water. And like one time the electricity just like went out. And to his credit, like he would eventually get things fixed. Granted, it would take like months and months sometimes. But learning to deal with small things, like I think before I moved, I always had someone to do things for me, like whether it be my family or my friends. And it meant that I didn't learn how to do basic things to take care of myself, like around the house, around like fixing stuff, like if the Wi-Fi was broken or if something was broken or whatever, or just standing up for myself as well. Like when my landlord was ignoring me in the past, I'd get someone else to talk to that kind of person and have that conversation for me because I didn't want to do it. But learning to stand your ground and take care of situations as well was so empowering. It was hard. It was so hard. And I had so many technical issues go wrong. And again, it was in a country where it wasn't my first language. So learning how to say all the different types of insurance and all the different types of tubes that you can have in your kitchen that would break, that would lead to this kind of issue was a learning curve. And there was days where I was just so tired and exhausted and I'd come home and I'd be like, oh my God, I just want to cry. What is going on? But again, it's those moments where you build self-trust because you see how you take care of yourself and you see that you have to learn to talk to yourself in an empowering way so that you don't feel bad about coming home and you always get to come home to you. And the community that you create. Like the home is not just the physical space, but the environment you create. And I was so lucky that I spoke earlier about being discerning about who you let into your space in your life. But that goes the other way. Like when I had all of these challenges, I was so lucky that all my friends who were part of this community that I had made would come and support me and would sit there while my floor was like broken and bumpy, or when my kitchen was flooding, and we'd laugh together. Like when I didn't have water working in my kitchen, I'd go and I'd cook with my friends. And so having those moments as well, like I think it made me realize that I don't want to live life completely unchallenged. Obviously, you don't want to seek out bad situations for yourself. And I'm so lucky that now I don't have to deal with that kind of situation and that life is about moving through and trying to like advance and get into better situations for yourself. But at the same time, it made me realize that there's something really empowering about being challenged and then overcoming it mentally, physically, spiritually, whatever, emotionally. And so again, one of the biggest takeaways that I got from living alone is it's not that deep. It's not that deep. It doesn't matter. And I know that it can be frustrating, like whatever goes wrong, it can be so annoying, but it will get fixed. And you'll either learn to fix it or you'll learn patience and the fact that it will get fixed and learning to just live with something that isn't 100% perfect. Now, I would like to caveat this again and give the health and safety warning that I am not advocating that anyone has any sort of like issue with their house. I think go speak to a landlord and get that fixed for sure. But at the same time, learning to just accept things and like not make it the end of the world. When I first had my first sort of like admin issues with my landlord in Spain, I would cry. I would find it really hard because I'd be like, oh my God, like this is too much. This is overwhelming. Like I can't do this. And then towards the end, when this situation would happen, I just found it funny because I had learned how to deal with it. I'd learned how to manage it. And I'd learn how to have conversations and stand up for myself. And the more that I did that, the more I was treated like seriously, and those issues got fixed quicker. So again, I think learning to stand up for yourself and boundaries, again, it's not just about who you let into your space and who you let into your life, but also learning that you deserve respect and you can take up space as well is so important. To wrap it up, in conclusion, these are the things that I learned living alone. And you don't have to have lived alone to know these things or to learn these things, but these are lessons that really, really benefited me. Number one, learn to self-process or self-validate. You can do this living alone. You can do this living with 10 people or more. But when you're feeling bad, learn to build trust with yourself and self-process. And you can journal, you can voice note. You don't even have to record it. You can just speak or you can just sit and meditate. But learning to take care of yourself emotionally is game changing because the trust you build with yourself is amazing. Number two, learn to be a little bit more discerning of who you let into your life and space. And again, this doesn't have to be living alone. It can be in your uni dorm, it can be in your office, it can be with your family, like whatever. But just checking in and just seeing like, how do I feel? Do I feel safe in the space? Do the people in the space make me feel comfortable to be myself and all this stuff? So important. Number three, I know it's cheesy and it's a Spider-Man quote, but with great power comes great responsibility. And it's true. If you have the freedom of living alone or living far away from your family or whatever, that comes with the responsibility to take care of yourself. And it's a responsibility, and you have to learn to strike a balance of giving yourself space to have fun and to do all the things that you enjoy, but also create structure and balance and routine for yourself so that you don't burn out or get overwhelmed or get sick physically, mentally, emotionally, whatever. Number four, loneliness and happiness can coexist. And I know if you're feeling lonely, it can suck. I've just moved back to London, and one thing about London is that everyone is so busy with their lives that it can get really lonely. And I wasn't used to that, and I found that really hard. But it's so possible to be lonely and happy at the same time, and learning to embrace that loneliness and not villainize it and talk about it and tell people, like, hey, I'm feeling lonely, let's hang out. And again, take it as an opportunity to see what you care about is so game changing. And to wrap it up again, whoever's annoying you or whatever situation is happening, it will pass. And learning to deal with it and learning patience and acceptance of that moment and that thing is so liberating. It's so cool. So I really, really hope that this helped and that you learned and that you laughed and that you enjoyed. And let me know your experiences about living alone, living abroad, what you think. Even if you haven't lived alone or abroad, like, what do you think about this idea of loneliness and building self-trust and looking after yourself? Like, let me know. Comment, because Spotify lets you comment now. Let me know on the podcast Instagram at Empower Sounds. And stay tuned for next week because we're going to have an interview and we're going to talk more about this topic as well in that. So, love you lots, and I'll see you next week.